gentlemen as they arrive.
All right, thank you for that, Marlene. I appreciate all your help with all of these things. So deeply appreciated. So thank you everyone for joining together again today. My name is Cody Russell. I'm with Kitsap Strong, and it's an honor and privilege to be here gathered together again on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. Just an acknowledgement that it was their stewardship of our shared land and waterways that enables us all to flourish in these incredible lands that we now call home. So wherever you're at, chances are you're standing on the ancestral land of humans who cared for and had a different paradigm and relationship with nature than maybe we tend to have today. And I think it's an important thing that we continue to think about, is that the way that we think about and our perspective on problems, solutions, all of that is influenced by our worldview, our mental model that we talked about last time. So we're going to start off with a little bit of review this morning and then dive in. For those that are excited about neuroscience, we're going to geek out a little bit over that. I hope that you're willing to at least lean into that if that's not your thing. But I think it's really important because it's fundamentally about understanding ourselves. And that's our goal here, is to deeper understand ourselves and then the humans that we work alongside. So I'm going to post again here in the chat box. My hope is that you can click on that link, and the link should take you to a page that looks a little bit like this. And I'm just asking you to reflect here in the opening minutes of our session. What were some takeaways from last week? What were some things that jumped out to you? What were some key learnings? Perhaps you did the homework that we offered you and you read the paper. You'll see I highlighted mine. I had a lot of fun reading and reviewing this article about connecting our brains to the rest of our bodies. I think it offered a great synopsis of all of the science information that we were talking about last week. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I would love it if you can, just a reminder here, you click the gray button at the top, and then that's how you can add in something. So for me, something that really kind of stood out from last week and from the reading that I did was the role of inflammation in chronic health. Chronic health conditions. And I realize this audience may fully understand and be very well versed in the role of inflammation in everything from diabetes and obesity to cardiovascular disease and depression. But for me, it was really powerful to see that all written out and very succinctly making the argument that these repeated experiences early in childhood can really have a profound impact on our lifelong health. And we're now starting to understand what that trajectory looks like. So I encourage you to use that. We'll continue to drop that link in there because just a reminder, the chat is not a historical document, meaning every time you log in, it's brand new, it's blank. And if you get bumped out and have to come back in, it'll come back blank. So we'll continue to drop it in there so that you can access it there if you need to. So thank you, everyone. We'll go ahead and get going, but it is helpful for me to see what resonated from last time. That helps me know how to take the conversation this time. And then again, if you have questions that you really want to make sure we try and address today, drop them into that fun retro. That'll be helpful for me, or you can throw them in the chat if that works better for you. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Like I mentioned earlier, we're going to do kind of a quick review of some of the science that we touched on last time. And then we are going to dive into some new learning for today. So just a reminder of the philosophy with which we want to gather today and the cultural environment that we want to create here is that we want to create a space where everyone feels like they can be as present and engaged as they need to be for right now. And I know that we are all navigating the unknown. So, like take what's helpful, leave the rest. We're going to cover a lot of science information. Hopefully some of it is helpful. I want to also remind you all that kind of my favorite quote comes from George Box, and it says that all models are wrong, some are useful. So I want to acknowledge and continue to help you think about, as we talk about different metaphors and analogies and models to help us understand human development, if you feel like, nah, that's too simplistic, well, yeah, it is, right? Like all of the models are fundamentally wrong, but my hope is that some of them might be useful and help us thinking about these conditions and thinking about these situations in our community. And then just a reminder also that we have kind of some group agreements for our discussion today. Sense of humor, respect, openness, try and create this learning environment and co-create this learning environment. Confidentiality, compassion, patience, self-care. So these are just kind of the ways in which I'd like us to lean in today. And then one more really important thing for humans, the unknown is stressful. That's one of the things that's so challenging about this pandemic is all of the unknowns. So whatever we can do to create structure, whatever we can do to create some idea about where we're going to go. And the researchers call this anticipatory guidance. But it's really helpful when you're working with a kid, when you're working with an adult, when you're working with anybody, to give them some idea about this is kind of the steps. This is what we're going to do. So we're going to do a refresher. We're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into the neuroscience. We're going to touch on epigenetics again. I'm going to show you this rat interactive computer simulation, which is really intriguing, at least to me. We're going to dive into polyvagal theory, which is a really emerging, fascinating understanding of ourselves and how we monitor our environments for safety. And then the last bubble, which is covered, is we're going to be talking about hope and trauma-informed care. So I saw last week that there was a big desire to talk about trauma-informed care. And I hope that you saw last session and throughout today's session, we're building the foundation for trauma-informed care strategies and structures and everything else. So I think it's based upon this shared understanding of human behavior that we start to do things differently and that we start to become more trauma-informed. And I'll use a story again today that I promised you last week about my experience with our 6-week-old when he was sick with meningitis and navigating 2 different ER settings in our community, and one that was much more trauma-informed than the other one. So just quickly, a reminder here, this is that neurosciences teeter-totter that we touched on last time. This idea being that there's some adverse experiences. On one side, there's kind of resiliency and protective factors on the other side, and that we have a fulcrum in the middle here, and that's our brain and our body, our epigenetics, and that both of those respond to our lived experiences, positive or negative, that we're experiencing throughout our lifehood, and that really the thing that makes the fulcrum move one way or the other is when the experiences outweigh the other. So if we have a whole bunch of resiliency factors, a whole bunch of protective factors in our life, our brains and bodies will actually adapt in a way to make us, quote, more resilient and help us navigate adversity as we develop those stronger neural capacities, neural connections and capacities. Similarly, if we experience lots and lots of adversity and we don't have the corresponding resiliency factors, relationships, and resources to help us balance out our teeter-totter, our fulcrum can actually slide in this direction, and that's what the researchers call toxic stress, where our brains and our bodies are actually adapting. And that's what the article really dove in deeply about, is that those types of experiences, whether adverse childhood experiences or other sources of toxic stress like racism and bullying, or community violence and poverty, those experiences can literally get underneath our skin, influencing the expression of our DNA and the interactions between body systems in a profound way, leading to increased inflammation and chronic disease in adulthood if we don't intervene and help our body calm down, release those chemicals, and somehow find a sense of safety. So just a reminder that neurosciences teeter-totter stands for neuroscience, the study of how our brain adapts to our lived experiences; epigenetics, on top of genetics, how the expression of our DNA adapts based on our lived experiences; adverse childhood experiences, or larger, this bundling of things that we call toxic stress; and then resiliency, those types of experiences that help us develop those capabilities and skills to help us navigate future stressful events in our lives. So what I'm going to do so that we don't spend the whole time just listening to me, I'm going to send you, Marlena, if we can send everybody to kind of groups of 3 into small groups. And I just want you to, reflect here again, what landed last week? What do you want to know more this week? So you can use the fun retro during your conversation if something comes up. But I just want you to have an opportunity to talk with some other people about what did you hear last week? What did you learn? What's resonating with you? What do you still have questions about from last week? So that we know how to take this conversation for the rest of today. So we're going to give you about 3 minutes or so in your small group room. So hopefully you've already been reflecting a little bit. I want you to just jump right into that conversation.
I'm opening the groups now.
Thank you.
All right, all rooms are closed.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Again, we do this with intention. I know it's not the most comfortable thing in a Zoom setting to be kind of teleported into a breakout room and then brought back, and it's kind of a discombobulating experience. The intention with why we do that is that, again, we know from adult learning that the earlier you hear your own voice in a conversation, the more engaged you are. So this is our attempt to try and help to foster that sense of safety and connection, and give you an opportunity to hear your own voice, and then also hear the voice of your peers, and as we start to think about this science information. And I appreciate those who went ahead and dropped some of the reflections into Fun Retro. It was really helpful for me to see kind of the messages and the things that were really sticky from last week, so to speak. So we're going to continue on with this conversation, continue thinking about how we navigate the world and how we learn and adapt to it. And this is obviously a simplistic illustration of our nervous system, but I think it's really important that we understand that our nervous system is the way in which we understand and are constantly being inundated with sensory information about our internal and external environment. Our brain is being inundated with literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of pieces of sensory information every second, and we're filtering out that information. My colleague Rick Griffin talks about the predictive brain. And I think this is really important that we understand, is that the way for our brains to be super efficient is that it can't just wait for the information and then respond to the information. It has to seek out patterns and start to make associations between things based on lived experience so that it can predict what's going to happen and anticipate how to respond. An example of that is if I were to show you an apple right now, you would probably have some sort of response to, even if you've never seen the variety of apple that I hold up, chances are you're going to acknowledge it. That's an apple. That looks like an apple. I've seen apples before. I'm going to put that in the giant bucket that is apples in my brain. And your body is going to activate your digestion system, and you're going to get ready. You're going to start to release the chemicals to help you break down that apple as you anticipate the opportunity of getting to eat the apple. Or if you don't like apples, you may already start to have a visceral response to seeing an apple held up. But the idea is that your brain sees the apple, makes an assumption about that apple, and starts to prepare our response based on that experience. These are really, really important things that we need to acknowledge, is that our brains are fundamentally built to observe patterns and make assumptions based on those patterns. And that our brains develop just like a garden. Our brains develop over time, and there's these seasons in which things will naturally flourish if we're giving the right conditions for those plants to flourish. So when we think about brain development, I like to think about this like the little plants that I go and buy at Fred Meyer and bring home and plant in my garden. Is that when a baby is born, they have every neural connection that they need to survive. So at the moment of birth, infants have to do some things if they're going to survive. They have some neural connections. You know, if you remember from last week, the hand model of the brain. So the brain develops from the bottom up first. So these connections are largely developed in utero. These connections in the brain stem, cerebellar vermis, these are the things that help us regulate our blood pressure, body temperature, heart rate, breathing, right? These things are developed before an infant is born. An infant needs to be able to breathe, regulate blood pressure, body temperature, those sorts of things. And then, you know, these are the fight, flight, and freeze, the hippocampus and amygdala. And then up here is the corpus callosum. And this develops latest in life. In fact, this isn't fully developed and doesn't resemble the adult brain circuitry until about age 26 or even later for the males in our audience. So these neurons develop much, much later in life. The idea being infants have every connection they need to survive. So infants at birth need to regulate blood pressure, body temperature, those sorts of things, but they also have the ability to connect. At the moment of birth, an infant, if you showed a human face, turn that face upside down, it still sees a human face. We see faces different than every other object in the world. We group the eyes, the nose, and the mouth into one single image. This helps us be able to recognize mom, auntie, uncle, caregiver versus total stranger. We are hardwired to see human faces and have a different type of response to human faces than to any other object that we see in the world. Why? Because at the moment of birth, the infant knows that it cannot fight or fly, run away on its own. It knows fundamentally that the only way it's going to survive is if it is effective at what we call flocking, which means connecting with another human so that you take the infant with you if you have to run away from danger, or you fight and protect the infant from whatever is dangerous in the environment. Infants know that they have to be protected. And then the brain garden grows and develops, and we create all these amazing neural connections. So these dendrites, these are the roots and branches that are connecting all the neurons in our brain. Those grow and proliferate like crazy. Your garden becomes super overgrown by elementary age. And this is why, if you've ever had the experience of learning a second language, all of those things happen just kind of easily if you're super young. You will see infants, if they're growing and exposed to a dual language learning center, they will rapidly learn to speak the language that they speak at their home and the language of other caregivers in their lives. If you've ever had the experience of learning a second language as an adult, you've felt the kind of the neurological pain of growing your garden outside of the season when it would naturally go on its own. I spent 7 years throughout high school, college, and a better part of a year living in Mexico. And the best conversation I ever had was with a 6-year-old in Mexico, right? It was the only person that I was able to talk with who he didn't have to slow down. I didn't have to speed up. I was able to talk fluidly with this 6-year-old, well, him and then like an 85-year-old who I think was just very kind to me. But what I'm trying to articulate here is that I had to devote lots of time and energy and repetition into creating those neurons and growing back those dendrites because I was trying to do it outside of the season and the window when it just naturally would have happened. If I would have been exposed to Spanish in my elementary school, or if I had been exposed to Spanish in my pre-K, I would have probably been able to speak fluently and had much less challenges learning it as an adult. So when we're thinking about this, we need to acknowledge that, again, just like our brain may be a garden and the roots and plants are growing, things don't impact our garden all the same. And when we're talking about effects of maltreatment, there's kind of 2 huge buckets that now the researchers are identifying. One is a bucket of threat, physical abuse, sexual abuse. This is like an animal walking through your garden, right? So there's plants that are going to get tromped down. There might be some branches that get chewed up and ripped off, that sort of analogy there. But that threat, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, is damaging certain plants in the garden. Another large bucket that we need to think about is deprivation. Deprivation is literally your garden not getting something that it needs. So denying sufficient water, sunlight to your garden. This is one way that we could start to think about something like fetal alcohol exposure as well. It's like pouring a toxin throughout the entire garden. So you are likely to see effects not just in one region of the brain, not just one plant here or there, but you're likely to see effects throughout the entire garden because that toxin was poured throughout the entire garden. Similarly, emotional neglect or physical neglect, not having the food or water that our brains need to develop and for our garden to grow effectively, can influence every single neuron in that garden, not just certain areas that are responsible for different things. But largely the researchers are acknowledging that it's the type of maltreatment that we need to pay attention to. So threat versus deprivation. It says gender here, but gender is a social construct. We should be thinking sex because whether you're a male or female matters neurologically speaking. And then the last one is the age. So if you're thinking about this brain garden, why would it matter if you are 6 months old and you've experienced sexual abuse, 6 years old and experienced sexual abuse, or you're 16 years old and experienced sexual abuse? Right? Well, what's happening there? Why is age matter so profoundly? Well, part of it is this experience and adaptation relationship that we've started to talk about. But part of it is also these sensitive periods that we were just acknowledging as well. So if you experience sexual abuse at 6 months old, even though you may not have any cognitive memory of it, your body and brain may be storing an actual memory of that experience, a memory of that trauma. And your brain and body might be adapting to that trauma so that the brain cells that are developing are largely the ones that are impacted. But I'll tell you here a story that helps you understand that even if you experience trauma early in life, the full implications of that trauma may not be seen or understood until much later in life, largely because of the neuroscience that we now understand about our developing brain and how that happens sequentially and through adaptation and over time. So thinking about this, one of the core kind of brain regions that we talk a lot about is this fight, flight, and freeze. I also introduced you to the word flock, right? That idea that if somebody says something kind of really weird, and your first response usually is to look around and see if anybody else heard whatever that statement was. And you're like, did anybody else hear that? Because otherwise you may just end up going crazy with whatever that statement was. But you look around, did somebody else hear that, right? That's the desire to flock. Flock, fight, flight, freeze, appease. These are our kind of limbic system responses to stress. The limbic system is vital for learning, memory, reward, and reinforcement. That positive reinforcement, that release of the chemicals, the relationship between what we call the feel-good chemicals in our brain, norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, that are released when we're doing something that we love. That's all connected to the limbic system and the reward system. So how does this play out? You eat an apple. You remember that you enjoyed eating the apple. Your brain is flooded with those feel-good chemicals, norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, and you're like, man, apples are awesome. You store in the memory in your limbic system, and actually memories are diffuse. I can't say that word. Memories are not stored in one nice bundle in one location in our brain. Actually, it's really fascinating. Memories are kind of compartmentalized. Imagine like a film. And at the end, when we're watching a film, everything is beautifully laid together. But there is a sound department, there's the visual department, there's the tactile department. There's all these different departments that are flowing together that have to be reconnected when you're watching the film. Our memories are stored in all different places throughout our brain. This might be why sometimes if you smell something, it can trigger a kind of a deep response in you, even if you don't really have a full conceptualization of what that memory is, but there's just a sense association there. So the limbic system is vital for that reward, learning, memory, and reinforcement. It also regulates our hormones, our mood, our heartbeat, and our sexual behavior. This part of our brain doesn't fully develop until adulthood. In fact, if you're thinking about teens in your life, any teenagers that you know who may struggle to regulate their hormones, their mood, their heartbeat, or their sexual behavior. Give them a little grace, give them a little empathy and understanding. Literally, they have fewer neurons that are trying to do that work than adults do. Because something that we have is these tiny packet of seedling cells that we carry with us. So if you remember back to this slide, if you're a gardener, the best time to garden and to plant new plants is after you've gone through and you've kind of pruned back all the branches that your body doesn't need. So by elementary age, our brain garden is fully overgrown, and puberty comes along and we go through and we prune back the branches that we don't need. And our brain makes that decision based on the amount of traffic that has happened on those neural connections. So if you are a city planner and you're going to decide, hey, we don't have enough resources to maintain all the roads in our community, you look at the roads that are getting the most traffic. Your brain garden goes through and says, hey, look, these branches are dead because we're never using them. The branches that were there so that I could learn Spanish, turns out I was never using them. So by puberty, cut them all away. And then Cody decides, I want to start learning Spanish, and I had to regrow all of those connections, just like if we decided that we tore up the road and now we want to reconnect that neighborhood and have to lay down a new road, right? So there's a packet of seedling cells, and that seedling cell packet is opened, and our brain gardener says, hey, puberty is the time to tear open that packet of seeds and let's start planting. One of the toxic stress implications, one of the things that happens when we're exposed to lots of adversity and we don't have enough access to healthy, stable adults to help us navigate, is that those seedling cells can actually die. So your brain goes to plant and to grow those new neurons, and literally those neurons, those seedling cells have died. Another area of our brain that has seedling cells is the cerebellar vermis. This is the palm of our brain. This is the part of our brain that's responsible for those positive feelings, the release of those chemicals, perception, attention. So literally, our peripheral vision is determined by our cerebellar vermis. And as you're exposed to lots and lots of danger in your life, your perceptual vision actually narrows. Think about a horse that has on the blinders. We do that because we are living in a world that is constantly inundating us with danger. And our brain cannot possibly process all of the dangerous stimulus. So we literally narrow our field of vision because we can only address what's directly in front of us. So what does that look like in a classroom? Kind of an adaptive way that if your peripheral vision is actually narrowed because of the amount of adversity that you've experienced, one of the adaptive responses that may show up in a classroom is a kid who's constantly kind of swiveling in their seat, trying to scan the environment because they are hyper-tuned and struggling to pay attention because they have adapted to constantly living in fear, constantly trying to navigate that dangerous situation. We also see changes in this part of the brain in virtually every type of persistent mental illness, from depression, chronic depression, to schizophrenia. We see adaptive changes in this part of the brain. We also see changes in this part of the brain associated with attention problems and with addiction. So I'm laying for you the foundation that maybe starts us thinking about acknowledging that what we now call mental illness in our community, we may need to think about as an adaptive response to traumatic experiences. And when we think about that, then how do we create the environments for individuals to feel a sense of safety, both psychologically, physically, emotionally, morally safe, and then repeatedly have those experiences of safety so that we can repair those regions of the brain and reconnect those neurons. Something that I also need us to acknowledge is that what might be therapeutic for these regions of the brain might look a lot different than what is currently covered by Medicaid in our community. What I mean by that is if you've had experiences of trauma that influenced your cerebellar vermis or your limbic system early in life, if your perception and your proprioception, your knowledge of where your body is in relationship to the surrounding world, you're not going to be able to heal those neural connections by sitting and talking about your feelings. What you're actually going to need is something like martial arts or yoga or playing soccer. You need to be up activating those neurons repeatedly in a safe environment. So you need to have some sense of safety, and then you need to be repeatedly activating those neural connections so that you can strengthen and grow them over time. So in the group care facility that I worked for kids that experienced sexual abuse, we did lots of experiential based therapy. So much of the therapy that we did with the kids was outside, playing out, running around. Hey, guess what? If you've ever gone on a swing and enjoyed the rocking back and forth, the swinging motion, that's the cerebellar vermis that is loving that activation of rocking back and forth in a swing. The last region of the brain that is really heavily influenced is this corpus callosum. That's the superhighway that connects the right and left hemispheres of our brain. There's an amazing podcast, Hidden Brain episode about the two brains, one head. I can't remember it right now. I'll link it in the resources so you guys can listen to it if you want to. There's lots of research that's happened about left hemisphere, right hemisphere. And I know that what I was learning when I was a kid is largely wrong about our hemispheres being divided and only things happening on one side. What we know now from stroke victims is that that's fundamentally wrong. But there are some differences in the left and right hemisphere. What's critical here is that you acknowledge that if there's an activity that's requiring the use of any of these, so spatial patterns and visual and auditory processing, like creating or appreciating art, that's requiring both of those to be intertwined. That's activating that superhighway. So this is where we start to acknowledge that things that are suddenly therapeutic are things like music, art, movement. Our right side of our brain controls the left side of our body and vice versa. So anything that crosses the midline, EMDR therapy is an example of things that require our brain to cross the corpus callosum and constantly be activating this corpus callosum. So rhythmic drumming and padding and tapping are all really amazing strategies that use the neuroscience and acknowledge that by activating that corpus callosum over and over again, we can start to create new neural connections and help people process through some trauma that they might have experienced. So I mentioned at the start of this that deprivation and threat, our bodies adapt differently to physical abuse or sexual abuse, and that sex matters as well. So males who experience neglect, we see profound adaptations in the hippocampus and amygdala and in the cerebellar vermis, and deficits in the corpus callosum for males that experience neglect. We don't see the same type of pervasive deficits in females who experience neglect in the earliest years, birth to 5. We don't know why. Similarly, females who experience sexual abuse in the ages of 9 to 10 have really significant impacts in the corpus callosum and in the hippocampus and amygdala. Males who experience sexual abuse during the same age do not see the same neurological adaptations occurring. The research is so new, they don't understand fully what the difference is. We just need to be knowledgeable and acknowledge that there is a difference and be mindful of it. So again, where we run into challenges is when the ways that we've adapted collides with the social expectations. I promised last time a new story about epigenetics. So this time, I'm gonna stop the share here. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop it into the chat. And while I'm setting up this next video, so we talked a lot about neuroscience. Now we're going to dive into epigenetics and the epigenetic changes that might occur based on our experiences. Before I get there, I want to make sure that if there's questions about the neuroscience that I just covered, that we touch on those. You can also take yourself off mute if you prefer and just ask the question. Yeah, so Danielle, what I was trying to say about sex and age is that females who experience sexual abuse between the ages of 9 and 10 really see profound adaptations in their brain regions, in the hippocampus and amygdala and the cerebellar vermis and the corpus callosum. Males who experience sexual abuse at the same ages, 9 to 10, do not see the same sort of profound adaptations. And the researchers, so all of this science that I'm sharing with you, it comes from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. And Dr. Martin Teicher has reviewed all of the slides that I'm sharing with you today. So know that it's simplified neuroscience, not because I don't believe that you couldn't understand much more complicated, but because I am reaching my capacity to communicate this information. But know that this is the science that Dr. Martin Teicher at the Center for Developing Child has reviewed, and this is his research and then others in the field contributing to this. The other thing, while I'm touching on sex and age, is we need to be really mindful about bullying. Dr. Martin Teicher's research in the last 5 years has been looking at literally doing brain scans and looking at the impacts of bullying during the middle school years. And we're seeing similar neurological adaptations from emotional abuse, bullying, as we see to sexual abuse early in life. So we're seeing really profound neurological adaptations that are occurring. And if you think about it, middle school is the time at which we are most kind of prepared, those preteen years, to start to expand our network of adults, expand our networks of human relationships. And we are most primed to be responsive to those sorts of interactions with our peers. We are really dependent upon our peers during those years. If you're experiencing bullying during those years, it is really, really profoundly impactful on our developing brain and can have lifelong health complications and implications. So hopefully that answers the question. Go ahead.
Cody, just quickly, you said fight, flight, flock, flee, and appease. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
Can you explain that a little bit more? Because that's the first time that I've actually heard flock. I've heard about flee, but flock and appease. Can you expand more?
Sure, yeah, thank you, Jody. So if we're trying to keep it all with F's, what they've used is flock, which means our very first response when we experience stress is to look for another human to help us. That's what's hardwired in, if you remember the developing infant brain, it cannot fight on its own, it cannot run on its own. So it's hardwired to first look for a relationship to help them. Now that is with the caveat that if you've then experienced adversity, if you've been harmed through relationships, if you've learned and adapted that humans cannot keep you safe, that you can't trust on humans to flock, your gut response is going to probably be more to the fight or fly, or that freeze. Freeze is synonymous with appease. It's that totally shutting down. They've also called it fainting. And you can see this is sometimes when people are asked to recount something super traumatic and they literally cannot remember, or they talk about being suspended, removed from their body. Sometimes victims of rape will talk about being totally disconnected from their body in the moment. And that's a neurological adaptive response. And it's the experience of totally being disconnected from the situation. It's that fainting that I literally could not move, even if I wanted to, because my brain was going into such a level of disassociation to keep me safe. So it was an adaptive response. Your brain is trying to protect yourself from your own body, in a sense, because you are being harmed through your own body.
Yeah, I've heard fawning as well as a way, but as you said flocking, I realized, is that why possibly bullies tend to always be in groups with each other, and other people tend to protect the bullies so it doesn't have to happen to them? I've just seen that a lot working with youth as well. So I'm wondering if that's flocking.
Yeah, right. Like it's you know, if we were to look at the way that primates interact, which is our closest genetic cousins, right? There tends to be a dominant primate, and they will flock around that dominant primate. And there is always one that is kind of singled out and targeted. And so I do think that there is some sense of like, hey, even if I don't agree with what the bullying's doing, if I align myself with the bully, I may pull myself out of their wrath. sort of approach, right? And it's back to these adaptive responses that we just try and cope. Thank you for the questions. I appreciate it. So I'm going to jump into epigenetics unless there's another question on the neuroscience. So this one is really intriguing. So this comes from the genetics lab at Utah, and we'll send out the link here with the notes and resources as well. So something to know, rats are our closest experimental cousins, so to speak, when it comes to the way that we do a lot of this research. Thankfully, there are laws protecting us from doing epigenetics research on humans with good reason. So we do use our rat cousins for a lot of this. I need to make sure that I'm sharing the sound here. So sorry, yeah, I was not, so you wouldn't have heard that. So we're gonna be some rat mothers, and we're gonna think about rat nurturing behavior and epigenetics and associated with that. So here we go. Let me see if I can get this logged up.
Deep in the brain of a newborn rat pup, methyl molecules, green, silence the GR gene. When it's active, the GR gene produces a protein that helps the body relax after a stressful event. The type of care a pup receives from its mother during the first week of life can change the expression of this gene.
So what we're going to watch is literally one gene being influenced. So this is that epigenetic concept of either turning it up, turning it down. So there's kind of a knob you can turn up or turn down based on the nurturing behavior of the mom. And licking is how mother rats show care and nurturing. So we're going to be a mom in our community, a rat mother, who has an amazing network of social support. This is a rat mom who's got paid maternity leave for 2 years, has got a stable caregiver next to her, has got aunties and uncles. So this is a rat mom who has all the resources she needs to show up every day and care for her little rat pups. So let's be that rat mom. You can watch in that, as she's licking and loving on her little one, you're seeing that gene literally respond to that caregiving.
Wow, you're an attentive rat mother. It's surprising your pup has any fur left on its body. Your licking and grooming has seriously activated your pup's GR gene. Your pup will have an easy time relaxing after stress. Your pup's GR gene will most likely look like this for the rest of its life. In fact, the amount of nurturing you gave to your pup will have a major impact on its adult personality.
Okay, so we saw here, you hopefully saw how the gene adapted significantly to the nurturing that happened during that early lifespan. I don't know the exact timeline here, how we could, associate that with early years. The research now is saying the first 1,000 days of infancy for human children. So if we back it up and consider from the moment of conception, all of our time in utero, because we know that that is super critical time. And then from the moment of birth, the first 1,000 days, those are the really super critical time period for brain development and for these epigenetic adaptations to happen very profoundly. So that doesn't mean once a kid hits 1,001, we can stop paying attention, but I do think it tells us that as a community, we really need to be mindful about what's happening in those first 1,000 days of life. So we're now going to be another mom, and I want us to be a rat mom. Maybe this is a rat mom who is in a violent relationship with her partner. And sometimes that rat mom is navigating so much stress, so much trauma, that it's hard for her to be as attentive as she wants to be. Maybe we're a rat mom who has chronic depression and is not getting the effective treatment for the depression to be able to mitigate that impact. And so that depression, the way it influences our rat pup is that sometimes we're not able to be consistent in our caregiving. So let's lick another rat pup here. So we love on our rat just as much, but it's just exhausting. It's really hard. There's a lot of other things that are pulling us away. Maybe we also are struggling with substance use and we're coping in that way. So here you see that the gene really didn't change very profoundly because there wasn't that level of nurturing that could have adjusted that GR gene. And again, the GR gene is associated with kind of that base level of stress. So they're rats, right? They're not humans. So there's obviously going to be differences about human caregiving and nurturing. But we are starting to see, and the epigeneticists are starting to try and understand, what does this look like in adults? And or in humans rather, and is there a way in which, if we can provide and really invest in those first 1,000 days in really responsive, nurturing caregiving, can we create the epigenetic type of changes so that those adults, those children who grow up in that environment, are likely to have those epigenetic adaptations and are then likely to have that same type of nurturing caregiving response when they have their own pups as adults. So the really fascinating thing that we don't get to see here is what they ended up doing after they took those 2 rat pups, with the one with the GR gene that was super activated and the one that was not. They then switched caregivers, right? So they put it with a super attentive mom and with a not as attentive mom. And they also just remove the caregiver entirely. And what they find is that those genetic adaptations largely stay in place unless you put them in a nurturing environment. Then that infant that hadn't had the nurturing will adapt over time. It takes some adaptation, it takes some repetition, but that the neuroplasticity and the epigenetic plasticity says that over time, we can continue to influence those adaptive responses. So I guess my key takeaway here is that the epigenetics is fundamentally wrong, but hopefully it's useful in thinking about these things and understanding how we see some of this intergenerational transmission, what that may look like. And that if we invested as a society to support all of our caregivers during those first 1,000 days of life, and did everything we could so that all caregivers had everything that they could to be the best possible parents for their little ones, we could have really profound intergenerational like return on investment from that type of investment. And I'm gonna jump back to our share. I just want to share one study that I really found super fascinating. Was and it came out of Canada. We're probably all familiar with really high quality early learning environments like Head Start and Early Head Start. In Canada, what they ended up doing was they set up a study and they put kids into the highest quality early learning environments, and they gave other kids, they gave their families just, I think it was $2,000 a month, right? So they gave them no parental education, no child development education. All they did was just give parents an extra $2,000 a month, reducing the parent stress load. In the lives of parenting adults, every time we survey them, there are 2 major sources of stress. Number 1 is their children. Number 2 is money. So what they did was just give parenting adults extra money to reduce the theory was, if we reduce the stress, parents can just be more attentive, more attuned, more engaged with their kids. And what they did was then track those kids all the way through kindergarten readiness and their trajectory into school. And what they found was that there was no statistical significance between those 2 groups. There was a profound statistical significance between those 2 groups and the kids who had no other intervention. So when they looked at the kindergarten classroom, they had kids that weren't in an early learning setting and didn't have that extra financial assistance. And those kids were struggling at alarming rates compared to the kids who either had families who just had a little bit more money so that they could be a little bit less stressed and could be a little bit more engaged with their kids, or the kids who had a super high quality early learning environment. I share that story because I think there's lots of creative ways that we could go about making sure that those earliest years are as nurturing as possible. We just need to be very creative in our solutions and our thinking and shift our concept around what is the actual problem. I wanted to acknowledge here as well that this epigenetics, and there was a great question that came after the last session about this. This epigenetics is confirming this concept that we talk about around historical trauma or intergenerational transmission of trauma. And that there are lots of layers to trauma exposure. This comes from the RISE Center. The RISE Center is an amazing organization in California. They're the ones who actually kind of challenged the ACEs pyramid and added in the extra layer of social context and historical trauma to the ACEs pyramid that the researchers have since adapted. So the RISE Center acknowledges that there's lots of different potential sources of stress and trauma that could be impacting our brains and bodies. And that some of those adaptations might be happening to us at a neurological level if we're experiencing those in our society, and that there are individual experiences. But I think this is also helping us understand that even if you're African American and you've somehow never experienced racism in our society, you may, by being a member of that group and by seeing other members that you identify with experience racism, you still may have a heightened sense of awareness, a heightened threat sense, because you are navigating a world in which you are inundated with messages that tell you that people that look like you aren't maybe full humans, aren't maybe have the same rights and privileges as other members of society. And this goes for our Native Americans, for our Hispanic Americans. This goes for all of these different groups that are experiencing structural and systemic racism and oppression. So again, I just wanted to remind us about the variance of that adverse childhood experiences stuff, the variation that we see across our community. And I know I asked last time, I don't know if anybody's willing to take themselves off of mute or put it in the chat, but any reflection about why we see this community variation. So this is, again, those communities that say they have 6 or more adverse childhood experiences. These are adults in the red section. 12 to 22% of the adults in that area said that they have 6 or more adverse childhood experiences. There we go. I don't know what just happened. Sorry, everybody. I have to stop my share somehow. So any thoughts on why we see that variation? Does it align with what you see in your community? Something to do with culture, maybe? Social supports and the infrastructure in the community? Yeah. Oh, rural areas, social, SES, that's social emotional status, right? No, socioeconomic status. Got it. Familial situations. Sorry, I had to pause my share. For some reason, my chat box disappears sometimes when I am sharing. So thank you for that. I think that there's a lot that we can think about. Also, we may need to be asking ourselves historically what has happened in this area, and why might we see this clustering. So maybe there was something that happened, level of education. Yeah, maybe we see clustering around areas in our community that were predominantly agricultural and logging industries. And now that industry is gone. And there might be this intergenerational transmission of, you know, what is it like to grow up in a place where everything that your family has always done for generations is no longer even an industry, and the profound kind of impact that that can have. So yeah, I appreciate the thinking. I think we just need to keep considering. And then I also want us to think about, as leaders in our community, how do we make decisions about investment of resources if we know that the need is not equitable? If we are not equal, rather, that how do we make decisions about where do we place our resources? Where do we prioritize? Where do we locate services if we know that there's a different distribution of need? And then the other thing I wanted to point out here, so this is a busy and confusing slide. This is the closest thing we have to understanding the intergenerational transmission of adverse childhood experiences. So on the kind of orange or red side, what we're looking at is people between the ages of 35 and 54. And we're looking at the different counties and then the percentage of individuals in that age range that said that they had 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. Okay. And then we're looking at the younger adults, 18 to 34 years old, So this is roughly a generation difference. It doesn't exactly line up that these are the adults of this population. But what we're seeing is as close as we could get based on the public health measures that we have right now, the concept of the intergenerational transmission of trauma. So here in Kitsap, 37% of our older adults and 37% of our younger adults have 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. That is actually probably good news, meaning that our community has been doing something to make sure that the intergenerational transmission isn't going in the opposite direction. If you look at Mason County, the top bar on there, so you're looking at around 35%, 37% of older adults have 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. Over 60% of the 18 to 34-year-olds have 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. And similarly, on the other end of this, Franklin County, they went from around 40% of their older adults having 3 or more adverse childhood experiences to down there less than 10% of their younger adults having 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. So maybe there's something we could learn from this. Ingrid, good question. Honestly, I don't know the answer to your question about why a county isn't listed. It's likely it could be challenges with formatting and literally getting it on the slide. It could be that the data isn't there. This all comes from the Burfis, that same study that I told you about from 10 years ago. We're gathering this data right now. My hope is we'll be able to invest in enough data analytics that we could try and get us a new version of this. And now we have 10 years of data. It's kind of like doing that generational comparison, although obviously it takes more than 10 years for a child to reach adulthood. So 10 years isn't quite long enough. We actually need 20 years to look at that generational comparison. But I can look for a county. If you want it, I can try and find the county data if it exists. And then just a reminder here about why we pay attention to those 10 adverse childhood experiences. Even when we know that there's other sources of toxic stress, those 10 are super important that we don't lose sight of. I want us to be inclusive while not making room on the, I really think that we can make room on the table for all different types of adversity. But if we're going to push things off and we're only going to pay attention to a few number, we need to be paying attention to those 10 adverse childhood experiences because of the science around how they cluster and because of the long-term health implications associated with those 10 adverse childhood experiences. So again, a reminder, 69% of mental illness is associated with adverse childhood experiences, 78% of IV drug use, 67% of suicide attempt, 62% of homelessness, which is not actually on here, 61% of incarceration of adults. So as a community, as we work to developing a trauma-informed community response, really what that means, a trauma-informed community is a community that understands that families, kids are experiencing adversity. And a trauma-informed response is a deliberate attempt to overload this side of the teeter-totter in every single person that we work with. And for the kids that have adapted to adversity, instead of rejecting them or pushing them out of our shared social spaces through shame, blame, punishment, kids get the loud message that, school isn't right for me. They struggle with peer interactions. And so they decide that either I'm not welcome at school and they're suspended, expelled, or they just stop attending because teacher doesn't seem to care, struggling with peer relationships. But everything that we can do to build our community response so that we wrap our support around and create that boot camp that I talked about last time, those intentional experiences and opportunities to build those neural connections, we can have profound influence on the health and well-being of the next generation. So I'm going to touch on this slide just rapidly here. And the reason why I want to touch on this slide is that earlier we were talking about the neuroscience and the different parts of our brain that are impacted based on the types of trauma and the age we are when we experience the trauma. Well, when we make the association between the neuroscience and knowing that all behavior is associated with neurological, literally neurons connecting and firing and wiring or not, right? Like all behavior is a function of neural activity. These are the different neurological regions in our brain or functions in our brain and body. Affect regulation, that is our mood. and how we're connected to the world, right? Somatic issues, how we're feeling and sensing our own body, substance use, sexuality, memory, arousal. These are all different neurological functions, and the health and social challenges that are associated with neurological adaptations in these regions. So when I say affect regulation, health and social challenges that are associated with adaptations around your ability to regulate your emotions are things like panic reactions, depression, and anxiety. Somatic issues that show up are things like hallucinations, sleep disturbances, severe obesity, pain, enuresis and encopresis, so bedwetting or trouble with bowel movements. Sadly, almost every single one of the youth that I worked with in the group care setting who had experienced sexual abuse had difficulty with somatic issues. They really struggled to know what their body was feeling, whether their tummy was full, when they needed to go to the bathroom. There was lots of challenges being connected to their own body. And if you think about it from an adaptive response, that makes sense. If your own body has been a source of pain, it makes sense to neurologically disconnect from your own body. So these same kids struggled navigating the physical environment. They had proprioception issues, meaning that they were clumsy, stumbled over things, were constantly, putting their hands on the walls. So the way that we kind of heal those sorts of neural connections is by stimulating those activities. So we play large body movements outside, we run and kick balls, we do martial arts, we do those sorts of things that stimulate those neurons and try and help it. But what I wanted to share here is an acknowledgement that life is hard and everybody is probably struggling with something. In fact, those individuals who had 0 adverse childhood experiences, on average, identify having 1 to 1.5 health and social challenges in their life. So if you got an ACE score of 0, people were saying, hey, I've got a little bit of pain and I'm smoking every single day, right? So they got 1.5, 2 challenges that they're navigating every day. With a little bit of pain and daily smoking, you can probably still show up and be the parent you want to be, the partner you want to be, the employee or the supervisor that you want to be. You're able to go through your day and do most of what you need to do. Yeah, you have a little bit of pain, but you're managing it through your smoking. You know you need to quit, but you're able to do what you need to do every day. As we kind of increase our stress dose, individuals with an adverse childhood experiences score of 7 or 8 have on average, 4.5 to 5 of these health and social challenges. So you've got a little bit of pain, you're smoking, you also have obesity, you're having trouble sleeping, and you have severe depression. Right? Are you able to be the mom, the dad, the caregiver that you want to be, the partner that you want to be every day, the employee or the supervisor that you want to be every day, or some days just a challenge to show up and be present? I'm sharing this because I want us to continue to build our level of empathy and understanding for the challenges that some members of our community might be bringing with them when they have these co-occurring health and social challenges that they're navigating. A reminder here around, and I'm borrowing from a whole nother training, which is a whole nother 8 hours of training. Another framework that we have is it's from Saint A, and this is Dr. Bruce Perry and his work. And so we do trauma-informed care training. And this is a slide from them, but I thought it was really relevant right now when we're thinking about COVID and how COVID is impacting our lives. So COVID is stress, boom. But COVID is not impacting us all equally. What I mean by that is that some individuals, depending upon the resources and relationships that they have, might be able to develop a sense of predictability around COVID. Okay, yeah, these things are happening, but this is our daily schedule. This is how we're going to do every single day. Moderate, so predictable, moderate, and controlled stress leads to what we call neurological resilience. It's the type of neural capabilities that help us navigate future stressful events. I think about playing a board game with my children. We play by the rules because I'm able to create predictable, moderate, and controlled stress. By playing that board game, there's always rules. That's the level of control. You always have choice in the game about what you do. It's moderate, meaning it has an end. You know it's going to end and it's predictable, right? Yeah, sometimes the board game ends up on the floor or one of us ends up in tears, more often me than them. But the reality there is that I'm helping build the neural connections in a safe environment for them to develop neurological resilience so that they can navigate future stressful events, because life is inherently stressful. On the other end, it's the type of stress that becomes, quote, toxic to our brains and leads to neurological vulnerability. This is not Brene Brown's work on vulnerability. This is vulnerability that leads to damages in the neurons and the connections between them that can lead to behavior adaptations and challenges in functioning. So stress that is unpredictable, that is severe and prolonged, leads to that vulnerability. So child abuse, when there isn't something, a caring adult to help moderate that stress, and the way we moderate stress is through relationships. The way we moderate stress is through relationships. So right now, I realize that none of us know when this thing is going to end. So it is by definition unpredictable. But we can create predictable routines for ourselves, for our employees, for our children, for our adults that we caregive for. Anything that we can do to create some sense of structure right now will help to reduce the stress and the impact of that stress on brains and bodies and long-term functioning. The way that we reduce the severity of that stress is through human connection and through relationships, is through experiences to activate and flood our bodies and brains with those feel-good chemicals. So that getting up and exercising every day, right? Creating that pattern of exercise every day, you are flooding your body and brain with those feel-good chemicals. That's a way to help reduce the severity of how the stress is inundating your neural synapses, right? So the way that we kind of clean up and clean out the stress, that stress hormone cortisol, physical exercise actually kind of cleans up the stress and reduces it. So we got to kind of clean it away. Relationships, human connection cleans that up. Music, art, right? Cultural activities are ways to help moderate the stress. And then the way that we reduce how prolonged it is and give a sense of control is through choice. And that's fundamentally what trauma-informed care is about, is an acknowledgement that stress is universal. We all experience stress. How we adapt to stress we can influence based upon how we as a community respond to that stressful stimulus and help people develop neurological resiliency or leave them on their own to develop neurological vulnerability. So we're going to head to another breakout room here, Marlena, if you're still with us.
I'm still here.
Yay, thank you. So let's spend another 3 minutes here in groups of 2 or 3. I really want you to think about this right now. How can we transform toxic stress into tolerable stress in our community? And I'll go ahead and add a column in the fun retro so you can drop any ideas that you may have on transforming toxic into tolerable stress. And if it helps, if you got a chance to look at that working paper, they had some policy recommendations on how we can transform toxic stress into tolerable stress. So you can pull the ideas from there, but we're gonna go to a small group, and I just want you to have an opportunity to reflect together. What could we do as a community to transform toxic stress into tolerable stress for kids, for adults, for elders, for our employees, for ourselves?
Just opened all the rooms.
Thank you, Marlena.
Thanks, ladies.
The rooms are closed.
Welcome back, friends. So I'm seeing some people drop some ideas into the fun retro. I appreciate that. Anyone want to take themselves off mute and also just share some ideas around what our community could do to transform toxic stress into tolerable stress?
Our group was talking about sort of knowing
learning and knowing what that place is within yourself, especially right now because of the social distancing, and to be able to take the time to identify that so that we can be prepared when we have those moments and instances where we can connect and be available for one another. So taking that time and making that space to discover what that is for oneself first.
Beautiful. Thank you for that, Naomi. Yeah, I think that's really important. Oh, look, a tiny brain joined us. I love that. More neural connections in that one than in most of us, in any of us, right? Like that right there. And if anybody wants to take themselves off mute, start speaking another language, those neurons will start firing. They're there ready to absorb any language you want to speak.
Oh my God, she's adorable. Is that she or he?
This is my 6-month-old grandson.
Oh, hello, 6 months old.
Yeah, and he's a bouncy boy. He's a bouncy boy.
And he loves being bounced and rocked, right?
Yes, well, he loves bouncing. He does that himself.
Yeah, you bet. Yes.
Michelle, you can have him back now.
Which is why jumping up and down on a trampoline is still awesome, right? The exact same neurons that are bouncing right there are the exact same neurons that like jumping up and down on a trampoline. Our brains are just brains, right? Like it's pretty simple, actually. And if we like it, it's activating that same sort of thing. And I doubt any of us as caregivers had to be taught to rock an infant back and forth. You just start doing it. And then those of us who are parents who return to the workplace probably had the experience. You come back and maybe you still got an infant at home and you're talking to somebody and you're doing this, and a caring other adult puts their hand on your shoulder and say, do you realize you're rocking? Like, sorry, I've been swaying for the last 15 minutes during our conversation and didn't even know that I was moving. I also don't know that I'm at work because I'm so exhausted and sleep deprived. But anyhow, yeah. So parenting is fundamentally hard. And what I want to leave us with as we continue on this journey is an acknowledgement that the way that we got here evolutionarily was that we fundamentally knew that caregiving was a social responsibility. And throughout the course of human history, since the time that we first started walking upright, the ratio has been 4 adults to every single child because childhood was hard. Lots of kids didn't survive and reach adulthood. And so every little clan, all of us are indigenous if we go back far enough. If we trace our roots deep enough, we're all indigenous. And all of us grew up in environments. Our ancestors grew up in environments where there were 4 adults for every single infant in that household, in that clan. And those 4 adults, auntie, uncle, cousins, had relationships and had a vested interest in that little one, and were doing everything they could to take care of that little 6-month-old and make sure that that 6-month-old makes it to adulthood. So when I start thinking about resiliency, that's what I start to think about, is that we are now living in a time in our society where we're asking more of single adults than we've ever had throughout the course of human history. There are more children in the United States of America growing up in households with single caregivers and with companion animals than with active fathers, right? And what we do as a society is we tend to shame and blame and punish those moms and say, why can't you, when their kid is acting like a child should out in public, instead of making sure that every kid has those 4 or more adults with a deep vested interest in their upbringing and supporting them. So this is where we're going to continue on with our journey here. If I can figure out how to get my slides to share. I'm gonna have to do some deep breathing. I'm clearly neurologically dysregulated, so I'm struggling to even figure out how to share my screen again, which you've seen me do before, so I know how to do it, but okay, here we go. So now we're gonna dive into a really fun bundle of information, the vagus nerve. And I mentioned earlier our predictive brain and this concept around trusting your gut. So, I apologize in advance. I am not going to be able to do this justice. This is amazing research that is less than 20 years old. Check out Dr. Stephen Porges, and we'll send some links to some information. But polyvagal polyvagal theory is really profound, really new way of understanding how our brains are interpreting our physical environment and our internal environment. Even if it's a new theory, this wisdom is age old. So the vagus nerve is the largest nerve in our brain, in our body, sorry. It connects our brainstem to our heart, our lungs, and our digestive system. Anybody here who's ever heard the phrase, trust your gut, or said, I have butterflies in my stomach? You're literally giving voice to the polyvagal nervous system and what it's doing in our body. So let's pretend you're walking along a dark alley and you start to get that sensation that there's just something off. Or for me, I'll use a story. I was doing a CPS investigation. I was at a home. There was concerns about domestic violence. The alleged perpetrator was supposed to be incarcerated. He had been let out of prison, and we knew that there was a chance that he might be around and having contact with the family. So I'm in the household doing my investigation. I knock on the door, show up, and lights are off. Things are looking a little weird. Mom invites me in, and Mom has a really, she's tried to cover it, but a very prominent bruise on her eye. So I had a sensation rippling throughout my body that something was off. I was not consciously aware that something was going on in the environment. Something just felt a little weird, and I asked her to kind of take me through the house. I wanted to make sure that she was the only one. She said she was the only one home. The kids were at school. And go into the master bedroom. It's very dark. The light switch doesn't work. And I can't tell you even to this day why I said it, but I said, and other than that, my polyvagal nervous system said, there is something wrong in the environment. You are unsafe. My stomach was feeling all weird. My lungs were on overdrive. My heart was pounding. And in the moment I said, hey, come out of the closet. Come out of the closet. I know you're in there. I did not see, did not know, but a man who was about 6'4", 300 pounds, comes out of the closet. He had been huddled down, trying to hide behind a pile of clothes. My vagus nervous system, the vagus nervous system is responsible, it's kind of your home security system. It is constantly sensing safety. What I knew intuitively, what my vagus nerve understood, that my brain and my words could not communicate, was way down here at a brainstem level. Her face, her body language, her tone of voice, Mother was communicating to me. She couldn't hide what her vagus nerve was communicating to me. Her vagus nerve, through her facial expression, her body posture, her tone of voice, was communicating, I'm not safe, and you being here is making me even more unsafe. And my body, at a very basic level, even though I didn't neurologically understand it, my body was sensing what Mom was communicating to me. Something isn't right. We are unsafe right now. I don't know why the hell we're unsafe, but we are unsafe. Saw something in the chat. I want to make sure that I'm responding to it if it's helpful. Yeah. Dr. Stephen Porges, P-O... I'm not going to be able to spell his name. I apologize. I'll figure it out. So I'll put it in the resource links when I send it out. How does anxiety disorder play with? Thank you, Danielle. Appreciate it. He's got some YouTube videos, some great stuff. So the way I like to think about this is I continue with, you guys have now become accustomed to the way that I think is with metaphors. So when I think about the polyvagal nervous system, I think about the fight, flight, and freeze, right? This idea of a fire raging inside of you. And what happens in order for a fire to burn is you need fuel, right? And your polysympathetic nervous system and your sympathetic nervous system turn up the fire. Your parasympathetic nervous system turns it down. Right? And that's a slow kind of, that's the fuel. Well, fires need two things in order to burn. They need fuel and they also need oxygen. I'm taking some deep breaths right now because I'm a little excited and dysregulated. Guess what? I'm activating my polyvagal nervous system. Every deep breath I take is activating my lungs in a new way. I'm being conscious of my lungs. My lungs are sending oxygenated blood through my heart. My heart is pumping that oxygenated blood to my brain and to the rest of my body. I'm literally using what I understand about my polyvagal system to help myself calm down in the moment. Something that I also could do if I had it with me right now is a sippy straw. Sucking through a sippy straw. For the first 2 years of life, we get all of our nutrition through sucking, through breastfeeding, through sucking on a nipple, on a bottle. When you suck on ice cubes, when you suck on a hard candy, when you suck on a straw or a thick smoothie, you're activating that same sort of brain stem level sort of sensation that you can use to help yourself calm down. And even calm, I don't like that word. I prefer regulate. So for those of you who have seen The Office, I am a deep lover of The Office. We watch this all the time in my household. This is the fire drill episode. If you haven't seen it, this is your homework for this episode, for this session is go watch The Office episode, the fire drill episode. And what the reason why I use this is that there's two characters in that are polyvagal, using their whole body to communicate two very different things. You'll see Dwight here, cool, calm, and collected. He's the one with the torch. He's the one who's actually setting off the fire drill. Throughout the entire episode, he's walking around, hands at his sides, just kind of like that flight attendant when there's turbulence, who's just like, hey, everything's okay. We've got this. He's using his tone of voice, his facial expression, his body posture to communicate to you, even without his words, to communicate to you that I am safe. We are safe. I will keep you safe. You can flock with me and I will take you to safety. He is communicating that throughout the entire episode, even though he's the one who caused the chaos that's ensuing. At the same time, you see on the far right, Michael Scott, who you can see, even though there's no audio here, you can see through his tone of voice, through his facial expression, through his body posture, he is loudly communicating, we are not okay. We are in danger. And I may not be somebody that can help you, that you can flock with to safety because I can't find my own safety right now. I think about the flight attendant. I also think about the experience of, let's say you're a child, you're in your household, you're in bed, you're asleep, and a caregiver comes in and wakes you up and says, our house is on fire. Just like we practice, mom, auntie, whoever is going out the window first, I'm going to hand you out to your brother or sister who's going to be out there, and we're going to go across the street to our meeting place, just like we've practiced, and we're going to be over there. We don't have time to go anywhere. I have the cat with us. They already jumped out the window. We don't have time to grab anything. We got to get out of the house because it's on fire. It's scary, right? You heard the word fire, so some part of your brain said, uh-oh, we're in danger. But my tone of voice, my posture, my physical presence is communicating to you, we're going to make it through this. We're safe. It's the flight attendant who gives you that experience of, even though things are kind of bouncing and shaking, they're breathing the oxygen into the situation. They're literally using their breath, their posture to communicate to you at a very basic level that you're safe. Similarly, by our tone of voice, our body posture, our facial expression, we can communicate to something, and we can tell somebody that they're unsafe. We can walk into that bedroom and scream, the house is on fire, and run out. And that's what we can do even if we don't intend to, right? We could still be using words that say, hey, everything's okay. But if on our face, we are exuding fear, if we are literally have shallow breathing and our heart is thumping and we don't feel safe, we are communicating that to people around us. So the challenge comes, and I think this is what the question was around, how do you regulate in the face of something that is really stressful? And I think that this is this is where I think about that garden metaphor and the idea about you can't, if you want to have those neural connections to help you navigate stressful situations, you can't create them in the moment of stress, right? So if you need those neural connections, you got to invest in the development of them. You got to invest in the growing them over time. If you don't yet have those neural connections, it's never too late, but we need to be patient and intentional about creating the experiences and opportunities for us to build those connections. I think about this when we start to think right now about this concept around self-care, is this idea around, we don't blame the tree for growing deep, strong roots. You wouldn't say the tree is selfish, right? We acknowledge that if the tree is going to be resilient to stress, to storm, to the next pandemic that impacts the community, that tree needs to invest in strong roots. That means they got to transfer time, energy, resources, attention into growing those roots. This for me is what it means when we practice self-care, when we deliberately do the things that we know we need to do each and every day, and we make it part of our routine, part of our structure. We invest in ourselves so that we can continue to be there and be resources for others when we're experiencing stress and when others need to rely on us. So I'm going to continue on with this conversation, this idea about executive functioning. And just to kind of hammer home this polyvagal idea, what I want you to know is just like we don't have control over how oxygenated blood reaches our fingertip, it always travels through our wrist, through our palm, up through our fingertip and back down. We don't have control over how we process sensory information. We are always processing sensory information with our brainstem, meaning our vagus nerve is processing information before our hippocampus and amygdala and before our corpus callosum. So if you have the experience of hearing somebody's tone of voice, looking at their face, and then they say something like, great job, but the way they said it, great job, you heard something different. It doesn't matter what word they used. What you heard was not great job. And this is how we communicate effectively. Yeah, sarcasm. This is how we communicate effectively with our fur babies in our household, right? This is how I can communicate to my dog effectively. My dog doesn't understand, neurologically doesn't understand the word that I just used maybe, but the tone of voice, my facial expression, they know that it's time to go on a walk and my dog is super excited. So when we're thinking about this, when we think about how our brains process information, executive functioning are those things that happen up here in the corpus callosum. Response inhibition, working memory, emotional control, flexibility, sustained attention, all of these things. And I told you last time, and we shared a resource called Tools for Working with People Experiencing Under High Levels of Stress. And it really identifies 10 techniques, tips, and tricks that you can use. It's one of our favorite handouts. Excuse me, and Marlena will share it again after this training. These 10 tips that you can use. But I used a story last time about how I started using this in my work as a social worker. I'm now going to tell you the story about my experience when our kid was sick and 6 weeks old. So you can imagine that situation as a loving father. It wasn't our firstborn, which means that maybe our stress load was a little bit different because we'd been through the, kid sick experience before. But we also had never seen our firstborn this sick. So at 6 weeks old, we are driving to the ER, and you can imagine we have definitely experienced some stress-induced executive dysfunction. So things are shutting down, right? Like I had to use Google Maps to get to the location, even though I've driven there many, many, many times. I literally couldn't figure out how to get to the hospital because at the moment, that's gone. So we're driving to the hospital, we show up, we go into the room, and in this particular hospital, there wasn't really a glass, there was a door. And so the room offered lots of privacy, but it also was very devoid of color and other things to make me feel a sense of calm and safety. And the medical professionals came in, started talking to us about the things that they wanted to do to our little 6-week-old, including doing a spinal tap to take out some spinal fluid to test it. And my partner and I, we were absolutely just like, oh my God, no. So we're trying to process everything that they said. They would tell us stuff, they would leave the room. They would come back, ask us for our decision. But in the moment, we're having trouble even remembering what they just said. What were our options? What are they asking us to think about? They're leaving us alone. I understand the intention was to give us the type of privacy for us to think about the choices, but we literally couldn't think in the moment. We were so flooded, we couldn't process all of that. So they come back and we're still struggling through the decisions and choices. And eventually my wife and I just look at each other and we're like, it doesn't feel right. At a vagus nerve level, it just didn't feel right. And we said, hey, we want to transfer care to another hospital. And I think they were worried that we were going to leave against medical advice and take our infant home. So they arranged an ambulance to take us to the next hospital. So my wife went with our son and I drove the car and drove to the other hospital. We show up. And what I need you to understand is that medically, they did exactly the same procedures. They repeated the exact same procedures. They talked us through the exact same steps. There was no medical difference in the care that we got at the second hospital. But at a fundamental level, the experience was profoundly different. We walked in, there was black splashes of color, a soft bench seat, big glass paneling, see-through doors. So even when they closed the door, we never had a sense that we were alone. They came and sat in the room with us as they were filling out all the documentation. They would ask us a question. They would write in shorthand on the whiteboard that was right there, the question that they were asking us. And then they would sit there and allow us time to process. They would listen to us processing the information and correct us when what we had heard, because we were struggling with verbal and working memory, was inaccurate. Actually, this is what we're wanting to do. Do you understand what we're trying to ask you to do? And then we also saw written on that board. So I don't know that the hospital would identify itself as trauma-informed, but I would tell you, and it doesn't necessarily need to consider itself trauma-informed. What they understood enough was that people under stress have these predictable responses, and that with a small amount of money, investing in a whiteboard and changing the way in which they worked with us as patients, they can provide a profoundly different experience for us. And throughout the 4 days that we were at the hospital, they continued to see that they would write the little information on that whiteboard, and it would remind us of what was going on, how our son was progressing in his care. It was a really, really powerful experience for me in thinking about all of this information and how it can influence the care that people receive while we're providing services. So, and thank you. Yeah, I think that these are simple solutions that don't cost a lot of money, but for the people that you work with can be really profound. So if we know that processing load, the brain gets full, we need to activate and create as much opportunities for repetition and as much opportunities for pause as possible. Okay? So oftentimes this could look like even getting up and taking a walk to process the information, right? We had the opportunity to walk with one of our nurses as she was going to fill up something and come back to ask questions. The physical movement requires my right hemisphere to communicate with my left hemisphere. As I'm walking down the hall in the hospital, they are actually literally activating more of my brain, and they're giving me this sense of pause. It gives your brain an opportunity to clear out some more space, to process some more information. That writing information on the whiteboard gave me an opportunity to not just receive information verbally, but have it written down for me. And then this initiating thing, that's that concept around hurdle help. So if you're taking the steps and breaking it down, in that tip paper that we offer, it's literally identifying the steps. Step 1, step 2, step 3, because when we're flooded, when we're trying to process information, we just hear the list of directions as one large thing. But if you say step 1, step 2, step 3, and then you ask somebody to repeat back to you, what are the steps? You're creating opportunity for repetition. You're creating opportunity for, again, their own voice. And in order for them to say back to you the steps, those neurons have to fire all over again, the same neurons that were firing when they heard you, and additional neurons have to be activated in order for them to say what you just said. It's a powerful strategy to really strengthen the learning, is to just ask them to repeat back, what are the 3 steps that I've asked you to do? So all of this, all what I was talking about, I'm going to steal one more slide here as we're approaching kind of our end of our session here. And actually, I'm realizing I may have to move forward. So this is another slide that we use a lot. And I've talked all through with the brain stem, this idea about different parts of our brain being largely responsible for different functions. The brain stem is largely responsible for heart rate, blood pressure, temperature. Diencephalon, this is the palm. This is the part of the brain that's responsible for sleep, appetite, so whether our belly's full, arousal, that waking up, that sensation. Limbic system is helping us with motor regulation, emotional reactivity, sexual behavior, attachment. And the cortex is associated with reward and attachment, concrete thought and abstract thought. These lines that you see there are like the highways connecting our community. So there are only so many roads that can get you from Silverdale to Bremerton or from Bremerton to Port Angeles. Eventually, there's lots of roads that connect together our neighborhoods. So there's lots of roads connecting each one of these little areas of the brain. Lots of neighborhood streets in the cortex, in the diencephalon. But if you're going to go from the diencephalon to the cortex, there's only one or two highways. And those highways are these neurochemical pathways: dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. Right? So the regions of the brain are really intimately connected, but in order to communicate across regions, we have to use these major superpower highways. So I share this with you because that also offers us an opportunity. So if somebody's cortex is offline, right? If they're struggling with abstract thought like I was, because there are ways in which you can use those neurochemical pathways to reactivate those brainstems. So what you need to do is get them up, get them moving, help them a sense of safety by communicating that to them, by showing them that they're safe, right? So when I say it's less about trauma, it's more about understanding our breathing, tapping, grounding. Yes, beautiful. Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to use this slide. This is another slide from our other curriculum, and I just rapidly want to touch on. Actually, nope. This is a teaser. I'm going to ask you guys to think about reaching out to us for another training, because this is a longer conversation. But this idea that we have what we call state-dependent functioning, and that the way that our brain functions is dependent upon how safe we feel, and we all understand that. So, but the reason why I'm moving forward is that I got to make sure that we end with some hope. So we have a collective choice. We can continue with kind of this framework around what's wrong with you, this shame, blame, punishment, and fault, or shift our perspective to what happened to you. What have you experienced? What are you experiencing right now? How are you experiencing this environment? Maybe that's another question we should be asking ourselves. That might be the question we should be asking our clients, and paying attention to the patterns, right? You don't need every client to tell you that it feels unsafe to sit with their back to the door before you start to acknowledge, hey, guess what? My clients, when I sit with them in this particular meeting room and their back is to the door, they tend to not. So what if we position stuff differently so that all of us feel a little bit safer? And all of these slides that I've just been showing you, these last couple of slides, come from this larger curriculum that we talk about when we talk about trauma-informed care. And trauma-informed care is kind of the next step on this journey. So what we've talked a lot about thus far is prevalence and impact. Prevalence of trauma, the impact that trauma has on our brains and bodies. And our entire intention with these last two sessions has tried to drive a perspective shift, get you to change the mental model that you have, to change the way you see the behaviors and the challenges that you may be faced with in your community, with the people that you work with, the people that you serve, the humans that you work alongside. And then the next step, what we were just talking a lot about, was this concept around regulation. And there's a lot of emerging science around what we can do to help ourselves regulate and then share that gift with others through the process of co-regulation. The next is this idea around relationship. Again, acknowledging that relationships, that we are fundamentally relational as human beings, and that we will seek relationship if and when we haven't been harmed through relationship. And Dr. Anda, the original ACEs researcher, suggests that trauma that happens in the context of relationship needs to be healed through the context of relationship. So even members of our community that have experienced trauma and experienced adversity in the form of relationship still may need relationships to help them heal. And then this idea around reason to be is this acknowledgement that suffering without meaning is its own kind of hell, as Dr. Anda talks about, and that finding a purpose in life, finding something that you do exceptional, and being able to share that gift with our community, that becomes your reason to be. And then the last one, the one that we need to pay a lot more attention to, is the amount of energy we are investing in growing our own roots, this concept of caregiver capacity. How are we supporting caregivers in our community in taking care of themselves? How are we creating cultures within those healing and helping professions where people are acknowledged, honored, and validated for doing the things they need to regulate, to take care of themselves, and to be the best they can in relationship with others. So I wanted to end with this idea. And those are just some slides. You guys will have access to those slides. Those are just slides on the progressive nature of adversity, and we can dive more into that at another time. But here's what I wanted to end us with, this idea of hope. Hope is being able to see that there's light despite all the darkness. That's the words of Desmond Tutu. Or it's this motivational force based on our expectations of future goals. Hope is the belief that tomorrow will be better than today and that I have the ability to make it so. So hope is actually these kind of three components. When researchers are researching, this comes from positive psychology, over 30 years of research that we've been doing. And hope is, these are the wrong slides. There we go. Hope is this expectation for some future goal, the willpower, the motivation to take the steps along the journey towards that ultimate goal, and the way power, the ability to construct the pathway, the steps to get to your goal. So hope is all three. Because agency, desire without a pathway is just a wish. And we use hope, like I hope that it doesn't rain today. That's not the way the researchers define hope, because I don't have any control over the weather. If I did, I would put out the fires in Colorado where my hometown is burning right now. I have no pathway. I have a desire, but I have no pathway. Pathway is critical for hope. The reason why I'm taking some time to talk about hope is that it aligns with this idea about our perspective and how powerfully our perspective can influence our well-being. So we asked people here in Washington State, so this is when we were doing that same telephone survey asking people about adversity and their adverse childhood experiences. We also asked them about these 4 domains of resiliency. We asked them about feeling socially and emotionally supported and hopeful about their future. We asked them about, did they just have 2 or more people that they could count on in a moment of need? We asked, did they live in a neighborhood where adults looked out for children, right? The best indicator of the quality of the neighborhood that you live in is, do adults intervene if kids are doing something that they shouldn't? And if you can say yes, go home tonight and from a safe social distance, thank every one of your neighbors for the environment that they create around your children, because all health outcomes improve if we say, yes, adults intervene if kids are doing something that they shouldn't. And this doesn't mean call 911. This means if my 4-year-old escapes and figures out our deadbolt and is out playing in the street while I'm taking a shower, that an adult sees them and sits with my 4-year-old and keeps my 4-year-old safe until I'm able to make it outside, right? And then the last thing is this idea of social bridging, is connecting people to the resources that they need most, reaching outside of our social network and connecting people with what the resources they need. So we asked people and we broke them into 2 groups. Always or usually, they said yes, they had hope, rarely or never. So high hope, low hope, high support, low support. And we also were asking them about their health challenges, right? So we were asking them about their daily activities. Were their daily activities limited due to health? And then we also were asking them about their adverse childhood experiences, 0 through 8. So you see 50% of people with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences said that they were experiencing challenges. Their daily activities were limited because of their physical health. These are our low hope. Now, when we asked them about hope, those same individuals who said that they had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. Only 30% were still struggling with daily challenges because of their health. Smoking improves when people feel hopeful and supported. Sleep improves when people feel hopeful and supported. Mental health. Depression is the leading cause of disability in the United States of America. We go from 35%, almost 45% of people with an ACE score of 4 or more who have low hope are experiencing poor mental health more than half of the last month. That drops down to less than 10% when people just feel supported and hopeful about the future. I want to end with, I don't know if I'm going to be able to open this up in the last 3 minutes. I will share out a slide deck. That's what I'll do. I'm going to share out a slide deck with some information about hope data and youth well-being outcomes in Washington State. So we just, in the last 2 years, Kitsap Strong led an initiative, a multi-county initiative to get 4 questions about hope added into the Healthy Youth Survey. These are the surveys that we ask our students in 6th grade, 8th grade, 10th grade, and 12th grade. And we pulled up that data, and actually I will try and find it if I can. While I'm doing that, I'm going to breathe and ask if anybody has any questions. You're like, yeah, right.
You talked about reaching out for a different training. Is that like collectively or that you're just looking for interest?
Sure, yeah, all of the above. So we do offer community trainings. So I don't know that we have it scheduled yet. That would be Marlena who would help answer that question. But we do offer that Saint Day training that I was talking about. We look to try and offer that. We'd also be open to coming and supporting some additional work through the OCH. And we can also, if your organization and your clinic is interested in that training, you can reach out to us separately through Kitsap Strong, and we'd be happy to collaborate and explore diving into that. So I wanted to end here because I want to just honor and thank all of you. I know that you are sources of hope in the lives of other people in our community, that you are probably one of those 2 people that they can count on in a moment of need. And I want to thank you for all that you do because it is super profound. And here's the data that shows that you helping kids have a vision for their future and create those pathways towards their future is really, really important. So this is the Healthy Youth Survey. This is the data on how many students actually complete it, the types of things that we're asking them. And thankfully in Washington State, most kids are hopeful. This is all pre-COVID. So 49% are highly hopeful, 28% are moderately hopeful. Thankfully, only 6% or 831 of the students that we were able to ask reported low or no hope. And this is why I wanted to share this with you. So we've got used to seeing those dose response relationships, those bar graphs. I want to show you the impact of hope, and that we can have that inverse impact. We can balance out teeter-totters or tip them in the other direction when we build hope, when we help kids have a vision for their future and feel like they can accomplish it. We go from 52% of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders who reported high anxiety as measured by these 2 questions. How often they were feeling over the last 2 weeks bothered by not being able to stop worrying or feeling anxious and nervous. 52% of our 8th graders, low hope, said that they had high anxiety. 14% of our high hope kids said that they had high anxiety. Hope is super powerful. Depression, 70% of our kids who responded to those 4 questions on the hope scale, 70% of them said that they had seriously considered suicide or had stopped doing something because they felt so sad or hopeless for 2 weeks or more. Depression and anxiety are the 2 leading co-occurring conditions with substance use. And then the last one I want to lead you with is 51% of our 8th graders seriously considered attempting suicide last year. 51% of those low hope These are 4 questions that we could be asking right now that could tell us how are kids coping through COVID and who are the kids that need help right now. And we could develop hope building interventions if we were just asking the questions. So I'll share a resource about measuring hope, asking about hope, and we would love to collaborate with any of you that are interested in measuring and building hope in our community. I know I'm over our time, so thank you for the grace of sticking on. I apologize for going over. It's been an honor and a privilege, and I'll hang out longer if people have some questions, but it's really been fun. Thank you so much for this opportunity.